Hello, how are you?
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. It's a rainy day in Tampa, right?
Definitely. I wasn't
Yeah.
expecting this today.
Yeah, me neither. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Which city did you grow up in Zimbabwe?
So I grew up in a small town called Norton, which is outside the city center of Harare. Yep.
Harare is the capital, right?
Harare is the capital. Yeah, that's
What?
correct.
How old were you when you left?
I was 18. I left Zimbabwe in 2006.
So 18 years. Do you can you tell me like what is it like to grow up in Norton? What is a normal day of a 17 to 16-year-old kid like looks like in Norton?
Oh my God. So that's a bit difficult only because I went to a boarding school when I was in Zimbabwe. So before I came to the US, I'd actually been in boarding school. So which means I spent most of my time in school and like only spend time at home during the breaks. So I didn't get that exposure. But before I went to high school, I can tell you what life was like. I mean, I lived in what everybody calls the ghetto, but it's like, where there's a lot of houses there. Every house is literally next to each other and everybody's very close to each other. It's a very big community. You know your neighbor, everybody knows their neighbor, you know everybody on your street, you know the people behind the street, you know people in the street in front of that. So it's like a huge community and everybody gets along. If anything happens in the neighborhood, you know who to ask and who not to ask. And everybody feels safe in that regard because everybody is so connected. But then the other part of it is when you go to high school and you go to boarding school, then you get to meet everybody from different backgrounds. So you're meeting people who came from the urban city, from the suburbs, and you come from. So in Zimbabwe, so the ghetto place is kind of called like a high density because it's a high number of people in a very small area, and then the low density is like the suburbs. So when you go to high school, then you get to see an exposure of different people from different backgrounds. Then you're like, oh, my life was completely different than everybody else.
Well, your community sounds like the kind of community I grew up in.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like everybody's in there, everybody's business.
Yep.
They're always ready to help and
Yeah.
ready to poke their nose into your business.
Yep. That's
That can be
exactly
annoying, it can be good, both. But that was um, the life, that's how you lived, and I didn't know anything else.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So you have mentioned the word ghetto twice. What
Yeah.
is this? A ghetto? I mean, where I grew up is also can fall into that category,
Yeah.
but ghetto has a different meaning in America. Do you agree, or
Completely different. So I think the ghetto in the US, I think, has been defined by a low income status and very impoverished and very underprivileged, with no resources at all. I think to some extent, it's like everybody's living off the government, to a certain extent. But I think the ghetto has been used in Zimbabwe only because we're trying to assimilate to the US, but and it's not exactly the same. So in the high density neighborhoods, you find middle income families, you find some high income families in there too. It's just the way that Zimbabwe was structured, I think, during the colonial times that blacks were segregated to those neighborhoods that had high densities. So you keep a lot of people in those small populations, those small areas, and you pack a lot of people in there. So you found a lot of families. You find highly regarded teachers in there. You find some doctors in there. But obviously, with the economies changing, people start moving from those high density areas to low density areas because they are realizing that this is not the place that they want to live. But the ghetto, in the common terms of the U.S., is completely different than what it's used in Zimbabwe.
okay? Did you? When I come from a cricket playing nation,
Yeah.
did you grow up playing cricket?
It's funny you talk about cricket because we played cricket on the street.
So do
Would
I.
would pick up some sticks or find a pole, put a marker on it, and then that's your wickets. And then you find we use tennis balls because you can actually find the cricket balls. You find a wooden stick, you carve it into a bat, and that's your bat. And people would play games all the time, and we would sit days and days watching the games too. So that was fun. So yeah, we definitely play cricket on the street all the time.
And we sometimes we didn't have another stick or wicket to mark your bowling mark, so we
Uh,
put a shoe there.
oh my God. I'm pretty sure we did that sometimes. But cricket is a very popular sport. Soccer was more popular than any other sport because you can create a soccer ball out of plastic paper, which is what usually would happen.
Right.
you don't have a soccer ball, so you just get a bunch of plastic papers, wrap them together with a string, and then you have a ball. And there were people who were really good at doing that. So we do that all day. You just have bricks on the corners as your gates, and that's it. And that's a whole day of games.
Did you ever hit a ball and it went into somebody's window or in the house and they got mad?
Well, we're talking about a very often occurring incident that happened a lot of the times. Most of the time, you'd either kick the ball in someone's yard who you're not supposed to, and you were kids, so you just climb the fence and go back and get the ball. I remember actually playing, so I got a basketball as a Christmas gift, and I was playing basketball outside in the garage. I don't know, I was trying to do some funny move, and I hit the window, and it shattered, and I was in trouble for a whole month for doing that.
Did they? But you were back at it after a month, right?
Oh, definitely after a month. I mean, I'm sure once in a while I would sneak out the basketball once in a while,
All right.
but it's one of those things like if something like that happens, the whole neighborhood knows.
Right.
So, and I was like the only one of the few kids who had a basketball at that time. So which means if I start playing basketball, a lot of my friends were not playing basketball at the same time.
Yeah, so it seems like a an average developing nation uh, story.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely.
yeah, like divided by distance, but similar kind of antics.
Exactly, exactly.
So when you came to the United States, you also went to a boarding school, or was it a normal high school?
So when I came to the United States, I went to United World College, which is an international school, and it was a boarding school. So it was definitely not a typical American high school experience because in Zimbabwe we have secondary school. So in secondary school you do Form 1 to Form 4, which is like part of your high school, and then you do an advanced level, which is Form 5 and Form 6. So when I left Zimbabwe, I done my Form 1 to Form 4, and I was just beginning my Form 5, and that's when I came to the US. So I did the IB program, which was part of that high school. So I only did 2 years of high school in the
It's
US.
called International Baccalaureate.
International baccalaureate, that's correct. Yeah.
And was that? I'm sure you came to that high school because you must have been very good at studies. Did that Was that quite intense for you in terms of academics and the workload?
I think the academics wasn't intense. I think it was the environment that was different at first because I didn't really adjusted as much as I wanted to. I think adjusting not in the sense of like it was difficult to adjust. It was adjusting because it was like so many things at the same time, so much exposure. So the United World College is it's a lot of different countries in one school. So I think at the time when I was there, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think 25% was American and the rest of it was international. So you have different cultures, you have different languages, you have different foods. So focusing on education was supposed to be the main goal, but then you also have all these other experiences that were happening. So I think that was the difference between being in Zimbabwe and being in the US. And the Zimbabwe was very academic, like, I was studying all the time and I was doing all these things. But when I came to the US, I wanted to experience all the cultures and all the different people that I was meeting at the first time. So that was a different adjustment.
So that you seems like was that a case for you, just for you, or you said like the 75% of the people were international, so they're all struggling together?
Everybody was, that was the good part. That's what united all of us. So you'd find out that even though I came from Zimbabwe, which is a British colony, so we speak English. We learn English in school. So you find out that other people didn't have the same exposure. So you're meeting people who don't speak English at all. You're meeting people who barely speak English, and we're meeting people who can speak English. So now you're mixing all these different cultures. So everybody's trying to learn from each other, and they're getting exposed to living in the U.S. Then there's a cultural difference, and then there's also weather difference. So there's all these other mixes that are happening at the same time.
Did you think, because same story for me, because of we both come from country that are British colony before,
Hmm.
and we speak better English than, for example, China,
Yeah.
people in China. So you thought, do you think that you had that advantage over other international people who didn't speak English as their first language?
I think, yeah, I think to a certain extent I did have some advantages of having that background, that you're taught English at a very young age. And yeah, I mean, I didn't learn to speak very well until I was a little bit older, but at least I could read and understand it. And I think that gave me an edge, a little bit of an edge. But I think because of the way the IB program was designed. Is they made sure that even though you were lacking in English, you would learn eventually. At the end of my 2 years there, the people who I started with, who didn't barely speak English, were speaking very well English, and now I'm sure they're fluent now because of that experience that they had.
So looking back your high school now, that you thought even though it was tough and you had to deal with too many things at once,
Yeah,
you think it made you stronger? Was
I
that a
think
good
so.
experience? Yeah.
I think so. I think that comes from the beginning, from in Zimbabwe when I first went to high school. So I went to an old boys school. So when you go to an old boys school,
Sorry to
it's
interrupt you. Can you tell us what is old boys school?
so an old boys school is like only boys. So so it's 1-6. So it's just only boys there. So being in an old boys school is a bit different of an experience, right? So you have older kids and younger kids, and everybody's trying to kind of integrate and learn from each other. But then at the same time, you also have to learn to hold your own as an individual. So you don't want people to bully you. You want to stand up as your own man. So that taught me a lot of things. So by the time when I got to high school in the US, I already learned a lot about myself, what I was capable of. But then you also find out other things that you're not aware of. You haven't been exposed to a worldly view, so you're only limited to the information that you have when you're in that high school in Zimbabwe. And then you get an exposure to all these different cultures. So now you're like kind of feeling like, where do I stand in the world? I remember like when I came to the US feeling like, oh, I didn't want to be Zimbabwean. I didn't want to be African. I liked, when you watch TV, you kind of assimilate certain cultures. So you watch TV, like African Americans are really cool. So we dress like African Americans. We did all of that. Then when I come to the US and I'm like, I also, people can hear you speak. So you hear your accent. They're like, where are you from? And you're like, oh, I'm from Zimbabwe. Yeah, I can tell by your accent, right? So you hear that. You're like, oh, I am Zimbabwean. I am African. And then you start remembering and starting to accept who you are a little bit more than, what you thought you wanted to be.
This is brilliant. So basically, what you're saying is that you wanted to, when you came, you wanted to like just shun or drop your Zimbabwean identity, African identity, and you want to be, I want to be an American,
Exactly.
right? And then you realize, no matter how much I try, I'm gonna be a Zimbabwean, right? As
Exactly.
soon as I open my
Exactly.
mouth or even like do anything, walk or gestures,
Yeah.
I will carry my identity on my sleeve.
Yeah.
So why not just accept it?
Yeah.
And you have become comfortable with that fact.
Definitely. I think when I go in any room and anywhere, I hope my accent is there, and I hope people know that I'm not from here and I'm different. Because I'm know for sure this is me, but I know there's a lot of people who go into different cultures and want to be that culture. They change their accents. They want to be part of that. They don't want people to know that they're from a different place. But I found a lot of value in being Zimbabwean and being African, and knowing that I'm not from here, I bring a different perspective to things. And people like that for the most part. I mean, some people want to hide it, but it's when you embrace some of your identity that other people don't have, that's when you realize there's a lot of value in it.
Beautiful. So, how long did it take the switch from not accepting that you're not trying to hide your African identity to totally wearing it,
I,
totally owning it?
I think it was like my first semester when
That
I
happened
realized,
fast.
I realized everybody was like happy for who they were. Like I met this guy from Cambodia, and he was happy from who he was, for who he was and where he came from. And my roommate was from Indonesia. He was happy with who he was. He was happy with his culture. He made his own dishes all the time, and and I was like, why do I have to be something that I'm not? And when I can embrace who I am. And there was also not pressure, but like there was also this like peer pressure, almost like you should embrace your identity, you should. And then they would have these conversations where people talk about their cultures. And sometimes when you're from your country, right, in your country, like you don't spend time talking about your culture, right, because you're leaving it. But then when I started talking about my culture, it's like we actually do some other things that are cool that people don't know about. And this is the time that I can shine on some of my things that people don't know about, because you get a lot of people who say like, back when I was in high school, a lot of people would think like, Africans live in trees, or they do all these things like we live in tribal areas where there's no electricity and there's no power and all these other things. But then if you don't embrace your culture, you're probably going to shy away from talking from where you're from, right? But if you are embracing your culture, You tell people we have nice houses, we have gates and fences, we have TVs, there's internet, there's all these other things that people never think the is. I'm talking about the time when I was in high school. Obviously, things have changed because the world has been exposed to a lot of things. I mean, the world is being exposed then, but there's a lot of things that people don't get firsthand that an individual like me can share with them that they don't get to see.
Wonderful. So, do you think this is a problem that a lot of people are struggling with, but not everybody is courageous enough to accept who they are? And it is not just about their nationality. Could be religion, could be or their sex orientation, or they could be color or face or tall or height, and they want to just shun it, just want to hide it and be something else that they're not.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is probably based on society and like the environment that they're growing up in and what they see around them. Like when I was in Zimbabwe, obviously everybody was embracing the African American culture, right? We're embracing how they dress, how the rap music. Like I was listening to 50, I still listen to 50 Cent, but I was listening to rap, right? Like everybody's listening to rap, so you're taking that information and you're trying to embrace it and make it your own, right? So there's that part. But then when you are stepping out of that environment and you're looking from the American perspective and you're looking back, you're like, oh, this is their culture and I love it and I enjoy it, but I'm not part of it. I'm also part of my own culture and I also enjoy my food and I also enjoy all these things. I remember going back to Zimbabwe and having reverse culture shock, right?
Please talk
So
more about it.
so I had been leaving, so I went back in 2010, which is a long time ago. But it was going back to Zimbabwe, and in a weird sense, right? I'd lived in America since 2006, right? So in America, to a certain extent, it's very diverse to compared to other countries, right? So you see, there's a lot of white people, there's a lot of like Asians, there's a lot of Hispanic people, there's all different people, right? But when you go to Zimbabwe, it's one color for the most part. So everybody's black. So there are, white people here and there. There are Indians, there are Asians there, but it's not a lot of them, right? So then you start seeing all those different things happening. You're like, oh, it's not very diverse. So that's the American part of me now. It's like when you go to a place, you're like, you don't see a lot of black people. Like this place is not that diverse, right? So I'm going home and I'm like, why is Zimbabwe not diverse, right? It's kind of a weird mind trick. So it's like reverse culture shock. When I left, I was like, Zimbabwe is perfect. There's nothing wrong with Zimbabwe. Like we don't have to be diverse. I come to the US, I'm like, this is diverse and it's different. And then there's the culture part. When I was here, like eating fast food when I was in Zimbabwe, eating fast food when I was growing up was like kind of like a luxury because it was expensive. So, we eat the staple food almost every day, and that's normal. When you go to the city center, you get to eat fast food, and that's kind of like a treat to yourself, or sometimes you go there for a good occasion, like, you did good in grades. When I went back in 2010, I didn't want to eat fast food because fast food here is different, right? I wanted to have local food, my home food, because I miss that. So my friends were like, why do you want to eat local food? Why don't you eat, like, why don't we go to a fast food restaurant, And to me, that's not what I wanted to experience. So that's reverse as well. That's kind of a reverse culture shock in that. And even like the conversation that people have, like, every culture has stigmas on certain people, people have stigmas on Africans, people have stigmas on Americans. So when you go home and then you start hearing all the stigmas, you're like, no, that's not true. Because to some extent, a lot of us think every single American is wealthy and is rich. Everybody lives in a nice house. Money grows on trees. So when you go back home, people would think you have lived in the U.S. Now you have money, but that's not true because I was just a student. So there's like things like that happen with reverse culture shock. Yeah.
So do you think you living in America for 4 or 5 years up and then going back to Zimbabwe, your own country and
hmm
hometown, did it make you look at your own people, your own culture, your own country, your own hometown in a different light?
It did. It did. There's a lot of things that either I took for granted, and there's also a lot of things that I would think like, oh, like why are things this way? Why do we have to do this? Like simple things like traffic lights, right? You take for granted traffic lights when you live in the US. Like a traffic light is like everywhere and it's always working. There's always water, there's always power, there's always internet, right? So you go home, you're like, oh, why I walk into a cafe, there's no internet? Like, you see, like that's the American side of you talking. But if I had been in Zimbabwe, I know that's a normal thing. You're not that's not standard to just have internet all the time when I went back in 2010. But there are places where it's there, but in most places, it's not like a normal thing to just have internet. And and back then also there were a lot of power cuts. You know, so at night, there'll be power cuts. So you take that things like that for granted, and you don't realize, when you're in the U.S., it's always there. So when I came back, I was like, oh my god, you know, I have a better life here, and also like even like cleanliness. Like I get shocked sometimes when I see trash. I'm like, these people, they just have trash on the ground. Like I see like a bottle of Coke or whatever on the ground. Like why didn't they do that? But at home, there's trash in a lot of places. And those are the things like sometimes you just miss when you're living in this environment, and then when you're back in your culture, you're like, oh, why don't we have these clean, and why do we don't have these other things? But it's also an infrastructure thing, it's also a money thing, there's also other factors that play into that.
So I'm sure you have also missed or sacrificed a lot of things by coming to America.
Yeah,
Like most people think, oh, you come to America, so you've got everything, you made it to the place everybody
yeah,
wants to come, right?
yeah,
But you also missed out on spending time with your family, your friends, right?
yeah.
So do you think has it still been a good experience overall? Living in America, um, the spiritual growth, the career growth, and then broadening your horizon and opening your mind. So it's been good experience so far, or do you think you would have been better off if you had never left Zimbabwe?
I think overall I've had a good experience. Actually, I have a great experience. For some reason, I've always wanted to leave Zimbabwe and go somewhere else and explore. I think there's like an adventure part of me that just wanted to go explore and do something different. So overall, I've had a great experience. I've met so many people in the U.S. I've learned so many things, and I think I've grown more here than I think I would have done in Zimbabwe because, in, to a certain extent, in Zimbabwe finding jobs, going to school and finding jobs, there's a lot of nepotism, and it's who you know and it's relationship. It happens here too,
Hmm.
but sometimes you can get jobs without knowing anyone just because of your qualifications. So in Zimbabwe, sometimes you have to know people, and I think opportunities that are and unemployment rates for people my age are very high. Um, so I've gotten better opportunities. But the only thing that I feel like I lagged on, and I struggle with, is friendships. So I left Zimbabwe when I was 18, right? So I had good friendships in high school, very strong relationships with a lot of people. And then when I come here, I have good friendships in high school as well, but I keep moving from place to place to place. Some relationships you can keep, but it's really difficult when you keep moving from one place to another and you keep moving like that. I've lived in like maybe 3 states now, so it's moving that reduces that friendships. And like you build relationships, but if you don't get to see those people, it's very difficult. You can communicate on WhatsApp, but over the time it dwindles. And there are friends who I can just call anytime and the connection feels like we talked yesterday. That happens. But I think I miss that part of having childhood friends, being close by, seeing each other growing together, seeing each other developing and being different people. And also the family part. Like when I came here, I didn't have any family here. I lived here. I think the first time my mother came here was last year in December. I'd lived here since 2006, and my mother had never been in the U.S. You know, and I have cousins who live in Canada, but no, they visited me when I was in college, but that was it. And the last time I went to Zimbabwe was in 2010. So my bond with my family is distant. I mean, obviously, I talk to them more often than I do my friends because they're family. But the family part has obviously been strained by that. All my cousins are grown; they have kids. I have a kid now. They haven't seen my kid. I haven't seen their kid. So it's that part that is kind of painful. That maintaining those long term friendships that you made, and also having that family bond that a lot of people have here or have when they're stable in their countries.
Thank you. Talking of friendship, do you think have you been able to? You've been living in America for 10 years.
About yeah.
You have formed any deeply meaningful, friendships with American people who grew up here? And if not, then what is the hindrance? What is the hurdle? Why can't you get? I mean, I don't know. Maybe you have been able to form good friendships.
That's interesting. Well, I guess my wife is American,
Right.
so that's a deep relationship and a
That's a
deep
deep relationship,
friendship.
but
But
she's
it's a
also your wife,
different,
right?
yeah. She's also my wife, so that's
Yeah.
different. But in terms of friendship, I've gravitated more towards international friends that I've formed deeper connections with. So I think the main reason is because we've more in common. And I've noticed this with Africans, with Europeans, with anyone who's not American who's coming here for the first time, right? They tend to gravitate towards other international friends because we know we are either struggling with the same thing. It could be college, it could be jobs. Jobs is the biggest connector because all of us, when we graduate, we're looking for jobs and we're finding places where we can get sponsored. So the only way you know where people get sponsored is by knowing another international student who got sponsored for that job. That's how
Mm.
you get that connection. So I think that's why. And connections with Americans, I think sometimes I've made connections with Americans, but it hasn't gotten that strong compared to like international friends. I have very strong friends with a lot of European people that I've met, but with Americans, I think it's a slightly different because I think there's a cultural aspect. Because with everybody else, they're experiencing a different world. They are global. They have traveled. They have seen other things, and this is like a second life for them as well. So with Americans, sometimes it's difficult unless if they've traveled. If they've traveled, then I've found that I have deeper connections with people who have traveled, who have gone to other places, or have experienced other cultures. But if it's somebody who hasn't done any of that, it's kind of difficult sometimes to trade those lines.
Very good. Do you think this is the last question? Like you have lived here for 10 years, and you also left Zimbabwe at 18.
Mm.
Do you think will you be American, fully American at ever, or fully Zimbabwe? I don't. It looks like you will never be either Zimbabwean or American. And are you okay with living that in between man life for the rest of your life?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I would never be one, right?
Right.
But I think at this point, I'm 35 now, so it next year I would have lived both in
Half
the
and half.
US half and half, right? And obviously, my first 18 years are not that influential in my life because I was going through puberty and I was also learning about myself. But this later part is more of me becoming myself. So I think part of it will be more American than it is Zimbabwean, only because of the culture has changed. I've lived here longer as an adult than I did as opposed when I was in Zimbabwe. So that would give me that. But in terms of who I am, I'll always be African and always be Zimbabwean. And I don't think that will ever change that. I get slightly offended when people cannot hear my accent because I want everybody to know that I'm not from here. But I also want people to know that part of me is from here, right? So I can never be from both countries. I was born in Zimbabwe, but I lived in Zimbabwe for 18 years. And next year I would have lived in the US for 18 years, and I'll probably live here longer than I have lived in Zimbabwe. So I think it's contradicting to a certain extent, but it's a good mix of having both cultures and knowing that you come from different backgrounds and you have kind of mingled that together and you know who you are as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for your time, Tatenda. And I think we also connect because we are international people in America, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I
Bye.
appreciate it.